In the late 13th century, a Chinese diplomat arrived at a tropical metropolis, and when he got there he could hardly believe his eyes. The metropolis he had reached was the great Angkor, the radiant capital of the Khmer Empire, where towering stone temples rose above the forests and gilded palaces gleamed in the sunlight. By his account, that city of Angkor was grander than anything in his homeland, a place of broad canals, golden bridges, processions of mighty elephants. And so imagine a city of perhaps 1,000,000 people, spread over a vast landscape of rice fields and reservoirs, sustained by ingenious irrigation works, and ruled by a king who was revered as a god. That was the scene of Angkor at its zenith, the heart of an empire that dominated mainland Southeast Asia for over 500 years. But how exactly did this remarkable civilization arise from the jungles of Cambodia? And what caused its power to ebb, its monuments to be swallowed by time? And here's another question. Why doesn't anybody talk about it? Well, at least the third question is answered immediately. I'm here to talk about it. The others we'll get to as we spend the next hour together. Allow me to welcome you to the channel first. I am your host, and if you are new here, well, it's good to meet you. If you're coming back, welcome to another video. Another ad-free video at that. As always, in keeping with this channel, it is 100% mid-roll free. You're not going to get interrupted by some ad that you don't want to hear and it's completely irrelevant to you anyway. We have them all turned off. And we can do this because of the kind contributions of those who support the channel, both on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the donation function, either in the PayPal or the Super Thanks, and also by those who check out the merch store. Lots of goodies there. That's what makes it possible. Links to all that in the description, and short of that, we do appreciate a like, comment, subscribe, comment, and share, right? I already said comment. And just tell your friends, hit the hype button, you know what to do. But most of all, let's just get nice and relaxed, and we can begin our video for today, for a full history of the Khmer Empire. Really hope you enjoy this one. Let's go. Well, first things first, every great empire has its roots in earlier cultures. They don't just spring out of nowhere overnight. Well, the Khmer Empire was certainly no exception to that rule. You see, long before the ascendance of Angkor, the lower Mekong region was home to the proto-Khmer kingdoms, known from fragmentary records and legends. Now, the earliest of these was Funan, which flourished from the 1st to the 6th century, in what is now southern Cambodia and Vietnam. Of course, the borders are all a little bit different from our modern conception of it, so we'll try to keep everything in the best geographical terms that we can. Now, we know about Funan primarily through the writings of ancient Chinese chroniclers, hence that name. Of course, it's certainly a Chinese name. Well, they described it as quite a rich kingdom, mainly focused around maritime traditions and trading. According to one famous account, the origin story of Funan was a romantic legend. An Indian Brahmin named Kaudinya was guided by a divine vision to sail to a faraway land. Well, upon arriving on Funan's shores, he encountered a warrior queen named Liu Ye, or Soma in some tellings, who ruled the local Naga, that is the snake people. Kaudinya used a sacred bow to subdue the queen, and then after that, he decided to marry her, uniting the Indian lineage with her native royal line. This legend of an Indian priest marrying a local queen is a bit of a symbolism reflecting how Indian cultural influence took root in Southeast Asia. And indeed Funan is credited with adopting Sanskrit as a scholarly language and Hinduism and Buddhism as religious frameworks, blending them together with the indigenous traditions which were already firmly in place. Excavations at the ancient Funan port of Ok Eo have unearthed Roman, Persian, and Indian goods, and that indicates that Funan was certainly a cosmopolitan hub of international trade, where merchant ships exchanged silk, spices, and even a little bit of gold from now and then. But politically, Funan was likely a confederation of coastal polities, and it exerted influence over a wide area. Chinese envoys visiting Funan in the 3rd century described a royal court of walled cities, canals, and a ruler who levied taxes on maritime commerce. However, much of Funan's history is still a bit of a, well, it's still up in the air to us. We don't have a lot of indigenous records, but what we do have are glimpses from foreign observers, and a few Sanskrit inscriptions on the stone found in the region. We do have a hell of a lot of archaeology, but sifting through that and coming to conclusions is a bit of a challenge unless we have something very concrete. Well, our textual sources do suggest that by the 5th and 6th centuries, Funan's kings bore Sanskrit names, and they would end in Varman, which actually means protector, indicating an early Indianized royalty. Funan's power began to wane in the 6th century, however, and it was eventually eclipsed by the rising inland kingdom known as Chenla. Now, Chenla, called Chenla in Chinese records, emerged in the late 6th and 7th centuries in the middle of the Mekong region. Essentially, we can call it a predecessor of the Angkorian realm. Chinese historians tell us that Chenla was originally a vassal, or perhaps a province, Funan, that gained independence and then eventually supremacy. In a cryptic account, they note that in the late 6th century, a Chenla prince conquered Funan and replaced it as the dominant kingdom. Modern scholarship interprets Chenla as not a single unified state, however, at least not at first, but a loose collection of Khmer principalities that gradually consolidated. During the 7th century, several notable Chenla kings expanded their domains. One king, Varman, remember that suffix as well, Varman, meaning protector, established a capital at Isanapura. So we can guess his name would be the protector of Isan. That's kind of clever, I don't think. Well, that is known today as Sambo Pre Kok in central Cambodia, where extensive ruins of temples still stand amid the forests, a testament again to a flourishing pre-Angkorian city. Well, the art and architecture of this era certainly show an evolving Khmer style. Brick temples with ornate carvings and lingas, that is, phallic symbols of Shiva from the Indian tradition, worshipped in sanctuaries that indicate the prominence of Hindu Shaivism. But at the same time, Mahayana Buddhism was also present. And that hints at a little bit of religious diversity. Yet, Chenla's political unity was pretty short-lived. You see, by the early 8th century, Chinese sources describe Chenla as divided into land Chenla in the northern inland areas, perhaps even Laos and northeast Thailand. And then we have water Chenla in the lower riverine areas of Cambodia. And this likely means the region fragmented into smaller states or clans. The reasons for this fragmentation? Well, we're not quite sure. Perhaps dynastic disputes, pressure from external powers, maybe. And indeed, some evidence does suggest that during the late 8th century, parts of Cambodia came under the influence of the Javanese kingdom of Srivijaya, Srivijaya, and the Sailendra dynasty from the Indonesian archipelago. Excuse me as I stumble over all these strange words. We'll get there eventually. Thank you for your patience. Now, an inscription from a later period hints that a Javanese king had actually intervened in Cambodian affairs, even installing a king at one point. One local ruler, for instance, is said to have angered Java, and of course, they dispatched of him quite quickly. You don't anger Java and get away with it, demonstrating the reach of foreign powers into mainland Southeast Asia at the time. Now, this period of decentralization and foreign influence set the stage for a pivotal figure to arise, a leader who would unite the Khmer lands and eventually inaugurate a new era. In the late 8th century, amid the patchwork of competing Chenla chiefs, a prince emerged who would later be known as Jayavarman II. Likely of noble Chenla lineage, Jayavarman's early life is pretty obscure. We don't know too much about that. Well, some later inscriptions claim that he had lived at the court of Java, which could mean Java itself or a more local kingdom actually named Java, before he actually returned to Cambodia. Whether he was an exiled prince gaining military training abroad, or a local warlord capitalizing on Java's retreat, by around 800 he began to carve out a kingdom of his own. The historical canvas was certainly ready for a new empire, and Jayavarman II would indeed be that founding architect of what is finally known as Angkor. Well, the year 802 CE is traditionally regarded as the birth of the Khmer Empire. Some people might give or take, but we're going to settle on that for the sake of the video, I suppose. According to a richly detailed inscription found later at the temple of Sdok Kak Tom, dated 1052 rather, but recounting earlier history, Jayavarman II orchestrated a grand ceremony atop a mountain. This is the sacred Mount Mahendraparvata, a sacred peak in the Kulen Hills, northeast of the Tonle Sap Lake. On that mountaintop, so the inscription tells us, Jayavarman had himself consecrated as the Chakravartin, universal monarch, and established the cult of the Devaraja, the god king. In this ritual, a Brahmin priest named Hiranyadhamma invoked the protective deity, likely a form of Shiva who would dwell in royal linga, that is a phallic symbol, as we mentioned, and grant divine legitimacy to the king's rule over all of the Khmer lands. By having a special linga of the Devaraja installed as the spiritual nexus of the kingdom, Jayavarman was effectively declaring independence from any foreign overlord and proclaiming himself the supreme sovereign of a unified realm. A pretty bold act. I suppose we can compare it to a coronation of sorts. In any case, a nation was founded. While it has a mythical ring, and indeed was recorded 2.5 centuries after it occurred, it encapsulates Jayavarman's historical role. He unified the splintered principalities of Cambodia into this single kingdom. In any case, after 802, he spent his years solidifying this rule. The inscriptions and later historians describe him as moving across the land, subjugating rival chieftains, and establishing new centers of power. He founded several capital cities in succession as he expanded his territory. One of his early bases was at Indrapura, possibly in today's Kampong Cham province, and later he settled in Hariharayala in the Rolos area, just north of the Great Lake, i.e. Tonle Sap. Hariharalaya, named for the dual Hindu gods of Hari and Hara, that is Vishnu and Shiva, would become especially significant as this seat of his successors and the first nucleus of Angkorian civilization. Jayavarman's reign 802 to 850 is sparsely documented by contemporary records, but later Angkorian kings looked back to him as a legendary founder. No inscriptions explicitly written by him survive, but his name and deeds are lauded in the text of later kings, which call him a great warrior, and praise him for causing the prosperity of Cambodia, like a veritable Indra, that is the rain god who brings fertility. Well, we also learn that he married into prior ruling families. One of his queens was a princess of the former kingdom of Sambupura, an old Chenla capital, thereby legitimizing his claim over a disparate region. By the time of his death, around 850, Jayavarman had certainly laid the foundation of the Khmer Empire, a centralized kingship imbued with divine sanction, controlling a realm that spanned much of present-day Cambodia and a few adjacent areas. Now, as for the power, it now passed to his descendants and lieutenants, who began the process of turning this newly unified kingdom into a durable empire. Jayavarman's successors in the 9th century further developed the Angkor region as their heartland. His immediate heir was perhaps his son Jayavarman III, about whom little is known, beyond a reputation for training war elephants. And then came Indravarman I, reigning from 877 to 89, and it is with Indravarman that we find the first burst of monumental construction, a clear evidence that the Angkorian kings were not content only to fight wars, but rather eager to display their wealth and piety through architecture. Ruling from the capital of Hariharalaya, Indravarman launched the ambitious building projects, signaling the prosperity of this young empire. In 879, he completed the temple of Preah Ko, the sacred bull, dedicating it to the memory of his royal ancestors. 6 elegant brick towers still stand at Preah Ko, each originally housing a Shiva linga and statues to the king's forebears, flanked by their symbolic guardian bulls, hence the name of the temple, Preah Ko, sacred bull. Now 2 years later, in 881, Indravarman I inaugurated Ba Kong, the first true temple mountain of Angkor. Ba Kong is a towering stepped pyramid of sandstone, designed to represent Mount Meru, a cosmic mountain at the center of the Hindu universe. With its grand scale and moat-enclosed campus, Ba Kong established the model for the state temples of Angkor, a symbolic mountain palace for the deity and the statement of royal divinity. Impressively, Ba Kong was surrounded by a massive moat and a concentric enclosure, reflecting advanced planning and considerable manpower, especially for the time. Now, equally significant, Indravarman invested in water management. He oversaw the creation of Indra Tataka, that is a reservoir, a large man-made lake called a bare near Hariharalaya, measuring roughly 3.8 kilometers by 0.8 kilometers. This reservoir stored water from seasonal rains and rivers, ensuring a stable irrigation supply for rice farming. By capturing monsoon waters and releasing them during the dry months, the reservoir bolstered agricultural yields that could support growing populations and feed the laborers that were working on the temples. Its harnessing of water would become a hallmark of Angkor, so much that later scholars described Angkor as a hydraulic civilization. Indravarman's bare, that dam, that water reservoir we're talking about, was the precursor to even larger reservoirs in the centuries to come, and with plenty of rice, the empire could sustain specialized craftsmen, priests, and a strong standing army. Surplus of food always does that. In effect, his reign demonstrated that Jayavarman II's political unification was being followed by economic and ritual consolidation. The land was being transformed by canals and temples, into the image of a sacred kingdom, with the king at its center. And then we get to Indravarman's son, Yasovarman I, reigning from 889 to 900. He continued the vigorous development, and is best known for relocating the capital to the new site that would become Angkor proper. Yasovarman founded the city of Yasodharapura, centered around a hill called Phnom Bakeng. He constructed on that hill a majestic temple mountain, this Phnom Bakeng temple, with 5 tiers and a quincunx of towers at the summit, again symbolizing Mount Meru and the cosmic order. The decision to move the royal city a bit further north and west, about 15 kilometers from Hariharalaya, might have been motivated by several factors: securing a more strategic location near the junction of Siem Reap River and the Great Lake, or perhaps personal and religious reasons to found a new holy city under his own aura. Phnom Bakeng's temple was dedicated around 900 CE to Shiva in the form of a linga, and it commanded a view of the surrounding plains, as if to watch over the capital. Now, crucially, Yasovarman I also built the East Baray, an immense rectangular reservoir about 7.5 kilometers long and about 1.8 kilometers wide, just east of the new capital. This East Baray dwarfed his father's Indrakata's Indrataka, and is astonishing even by modern standards. It impounded tens of millions of cubic meters of water. In the middle of the Baray, Yasovarman placed a temple on an artificial island, the East Mebon, added a few decades later once the Baray was operational, creating a sacred geography where water, earth, and the temple aligned. The Baray served practical irrigation purposes, but likely had ritual significance as well, perhaps representing the cosmic sea of milk surrounding Mount Meru. Yasovarman, a devout Hindu and also a patron of Buddhism, reportedly built numerous hermitages called asramas on mountain tops across his kingdom for the ascetics to go to and perform their meditations. This suggests a ruler keen on establishing religious merit and presence in all corners of the realm. Under Yasovarman, Angkor truly began to take shape as a vast urban religious complex, albeit still in its formative setting. However, the path to empire is rarely smooth. The 10th century witnessed some internal conflicts and power shifts, indicating that even as the kingdom grew stronger, rivalries persisted within the royal family. After Yasovarman's death, his sons Harshavarman and Isanavarman had relatively short reigns, marked by challenges to their authority. By the 920s, a powerful usurper emerged, Jayavarman IV, a relative of the royal line, perhaps a cousin or uncle, who did something quite striking. He abandoned Angkor for a new capital at Chok Gargyar, better known as Kokher. For about 2 decades, that is from 928 to 944, Kokher in the northeast became the seat of a breakaway court. Jayavarman IV built at Kokher an array of impressive monuments, including a massive pyramid temple called Prasat Tom, rising over 30 meters high. The scale of construction there within a short span speaks to the resources he commanded. Why he shifted the capital is a bit of a debate, and it could be that he had a power base in that region and was contesting legitimacy with those at Angkor. But in any case, Angkor was temporarily sidelined, but it wasn't abandoned entirely. One of Yasovarman's sons continued to rule part of the country during his time. Well, this shows that even a consecrated god king could face rebellion. No one's immune from that. The divine aura of kingship was powerful, but there was no guarantee of unquestioned obedience, especially if the political factions were strong. Well, eventually, unity was restored when Rajendra Varman II, reigning from 944 to 68, a successor who likely had ties to both factions, took the throne, and first things first, he brought the capital back to Angkor. Rajendra Varman II's reign was something of a renaissance after the tumult. He reaffirmed Angkor, also known as Yasodharapura, as the imperial capital, and embarked on a new round of building and administration. Notably, he constructed the East Mebon Temple on the island in the middle of Yasovarman's Great East Brae, dedicating it to Shiva and to the memory of his parents. This temple's very location, reachable only by boat when the Brae was full, showed the union of sacred kingship and this new hydraulic might. Rajendra Varman II also built the temple of Prayurup, completed around 961, a large brick and laterite pyramid that likely served as his state temple, and perhaps his funerary temple. The name Prayurup actually refers to a cremation ritual. With its warm-colored bricks and elegant layout, Prayurup stands as the last major temple made primarily of brick. Thereafter, sandstone became the primary medium for the Angkorian temples due to its durability and fine carving quality. In any case, under Rajendra Varman, the kingdom also saw further consolidation of its territories. Inscriptions from its time indicate a well-organized court with officials handling everything from rice fields to rituals, and mention campaigns to subdue local chieftains or fend off incursions. Some records hint at clashes with Champa or Siamese areas. Well, he even maintained diplomatic contact with China. A Chinese record notes that an envoy from the Khmer kingdom reached the Chinese court in the 960s, suggesting international relations were indeed active. Well, by the mid-10th century, the Khmer Empire had stabilized after earlier disruptions. At Angkor, a pattern was re-emerging. Each king sought to leave a mark through temple construction, and infrastructure often reflected religious devotion and assertions of legitimacy. The interplay of Hinduism and royal power was certainly intense. Temples were not merely places of worship, but statements of political theology, and Brahmin priests and scholars from India or locally trained Sanskrit were present at court, composing eulogistic inscriptions for the kings. For example, one inscription praises Rajendra Varman as a lion of a king who extols the temples he builds as rivals to the sun and moon. Yet, while kings glorified themselves, they also endowed land to temples and sanctuaries, creating a whole sacred economy where villagers were assigned to maintain temples, and rituals for the gods, and by extension their deified kings, were performed regularly within. Such developments hinted a sophisticated state apparatus by the 10th century, capable of mobilizing labor, controlling surplus produce, and blending spiritual authority with the right governance. Never an easy balance, I suppose. And so we find ourselves in the late 10th century. The new monarch Jayavarman V, reigning 968 to 1001, ascended the throne as a youth and presided over what some describe as a cultural golden age at Angkor. And, well, I suppose that's a fair assessment. Jayavarman V's reign was relatively peaceful and long, fostering a flourishing of art, literature, and scholarship, and he established a new palace. Since royal palaces were built of wood, none of us survived, unfortunately, but inscriptions do mention their construction, so you get what you're given, I'm afraid. He also oversaw the creation of the temples that exemplified refined aesthetics. One of the most exquisite temples of this period is Bante Sarai, consecrated in 967. Now, fair enough, that's a little bit before Jayavarman's reign, but certainly under his tutelage. though not built by the king himself. It was built by a Brahmin guru named Yanyavara, who was a tutor to the prince. Bante Sarai's significance in Khmer art is quite immense. Its pink sandstone walls are covered in deep, intricate carvings of Hindu legends, executed with virtuosity that has led it be nicknamed the jewel of Khmer art. The fact that a scholar official could build such a masterpiece under the king's patronage indicates the supportive environment for the arts. At Jayavarman's court, there were also notable intellectuals, and perhaps the compilation of law codes or treatises, though these survive only indirectly. But this era's legacy is a demonstration that the civilization of Angkor was not only about military exploits, but also about cultivating knowledge and artistic perfection. However, golden ages tend to have their shadows. Can't all be good times. After Jayavarman V, the early 11th century saw a succession dispute and rival claimants battling for power. Inscriptional gaps and later reports suggest a period of intrigue and possibly short-lived kings. Eventually, by 1010, a usurper from a distant branch of the royal family emerged victorious, Suryavarman I. Now, Suryavarman's origins are a little bit unclear, but it is suggested he came from a region to the west, perhaps present-day Thailand or the Lao border areas. What is clear is that he had to fight for the throne. At least one long inscription narrates that he defeated another prince in battle to become king. Once established, Suryavarman, reigning from 1010 to 1050, proved to be one of Angkor's greatest consolidators and empire builders. He energetically expanded the empire's frontiers. Under his reign, the Khmer control pushed westward and northward. We see evidence that areas in the Chao Phraya Valley of today's Thailand, like Lavo or Lopburi, were brought under Angkor's hegemony, as were parts of the Korat Plateau, northeast Thailand and southern Laos. He is credited with unifying land Chenla and water Chenla fully, meaning all disparate Khmer-speaking regions acknowledged his authority. Titles in his inscription style him as the King of Kings, the paramount sovereign to all Khmer lands, reflecting this new level of dominance. Well, in modern terms, he transformed the Khmer realm into a true territorial empire, controlling a vast swath of mainland Southeast Asia, either directly or through a system of vassals. One notable record describes Suryavarman entering into correspondence or conflict, perhaps, with the kingdom of Tambralinga on the Malay Peninsula, even sending a mission to the Chola dynasty in South India. Indeed, an intriguing historical footnote, a Tamil inscription from South India mentions a king of Kanbujadasa, or Cambodia, sending a chariot as tribute to the Chola emperor Rajendra Chola around the 1020s. Such interactions demonstrate that Angkor was firmly part of the regional system of diplomacy and trade, projecting power and also engaging a cultural exchange beyond its immediate borders. So within his kingdom, Suryavarman was a prolific builder and reformer. He likely established a new royal palace at Angkor, though as noted, palaces were perishable, so we only know about that from the texts. He also commissioned the largest reservoir ever built at Angkor, the West Barai, ensuring agricultural abundance. The West Barai began under Suryavarman and completed by its successors, measures about 8 by 2.2 kilometers, and even to this very day it holds water. To visualize its scale, this immense artificial lake enclosed by earthen ramps could store roughly 50 million cubic meters of water. I'm not a math magician, but that seems like quite a lot. Well, it was an engineering marvel of its age, requiring the excavation and transport of gigantic volumes of earth. For the West Barai, Angkor's irrigation network could support double or triple cropping of rice in its core area, providing a stable surplus of food. The benefits of this sustaining a large population and army cannot be overstated. As an island on the West Barai, the West Mabon Temple was also erected, where colossal bronze statues of Vishnu were installed. Fragments of this bronze Vishnu have been found by archaeologists, indicating the wealth and artistry of the reign of Suryavarman. Now, his devotion to religion also left architectural footprints, Inscriptions show that he was a fervent devotee of Shiva and Vishnu, which were, of course, Hindu deities. But he also was some accommodating to Buddhism. Interestingly, he allowed the construction of some Buddhist monuments, which does suggest that Mahayana or Theravada Buddhist communities did have a presence. Theravada Buddhism, imported from Mon and Sri Lankan tradition, was quietly growing during this period, although it wasn't yet the state religion. One of the most spectacular hilltop temples, Priya Vihar, perched atop the Dangrek Mountains on the modern Thai-Cambodian border, was developed into its classical form during Suryavarman's time. He added it and endowed it, tying the distant hill shrine into his imperial cult. The location of Priya Vihar, commanding a view far into the plains, also symbolized Khmer dominion reaching to the edge of their world. But governing this large empire was going to be a bit of a difficult task, and to do so, he had to first strengthen the administrative system. Titles of many officials appear in his inscriptions, suggesting a hierarchy of royal ministers, regional governors, military commanders, and temple supervisors. He standardized some legal codes and property rights, evidenced by the record of land grants and regulations on irrigation use. And indeed, governance and religion were intertwined. Temples often acted as economic centers, holding land and workers, so managing temple estates was akin to managing provinces. Suryavarman appointed royal inspectors and built rest houses and roads connecting key sites, indicating a concern for the integration of infrastructure. For example, we read of a road from Angkor to Phai Mai, which is in today's Thailand, being maintained, dotted with chapels and shelters for travelers. Really, through Suryavarman's 4-decade reign, the Khmer Empire really did reach a new peak of territorial extent, organization, and, sophistication in infrastructure. I suppose you could say that the empire truly matured under him, or was a coming of age. It was now a colossus of the region, rivaled perhaps only by the distant empire of Pagan in Burma, or the Dai Viet kingdom in Vietnam. But when somebody mentioned the empire at those times in that area, well, you could well assume they were talking about the Khmer. Following Suryavarman's death around 1050, a brief succession struggle ensued, but his legacy endured through his son Udayatya Varman, thus reigning from 1050 to 1066, who took up the mantle. Udayatya Varman II completed the West Barai and continued the building spree that his father had started. His major contribution was the temple of Ba Phuon, a massive pyramid near the heart of Angkor Thom, though we should say that Angkor Thom was not a walled city at that time and did not exist yet. That area would later become, as it was already populated with earlier palaces and temples, but it's not as we know it, quite. Well, the Ba Phuon, dedicated in the mid-11th century to Shiva, was described as the Bronze Mountain in later records, likely because its tower was gilded or covered in bronze plates, and of course they shine quite brilliantly in the sun. Though partial collapse today, the Bafwan in its prime was one of Angkor's grandest temples, with a base 120 meters long on each side and steep tiered terraces rising high. Its construction further confirms the resources available to Khmer kings. An inscription from this time boasts of a linga so tall and an image of the reclining Buddha so large that they were astonishing to onlookers. Also, what is quite telling is an incident during Udayadityavarman's rule. A powerful palace official named Sivaita rebelled, causing a civil war until the king's general finally suppressed it. Now, that suppression is triumphantly recorded in stone, with the traitor, quote, fleeing into the forests, an event that reveals even at the height of power the king had to guard against usurpers from ambitious courtiers. The Khmer Empire, in any case, was centralized, but outlying provinces or powerful ministers could still pose challenges, a dynamic typical of large pre-modern empires. Nonetheless, stability returned and was maintained. By the end of the 11th century, the empire had enjoyed relative continuity for around 100 years since Suryavarma's ascent, and a new generation of kings prepared to build on that foundation. One ruler in the late 11th century, Harshavarman III, is little known, suggesting that he and a couple of others ruled quite briefly. But soon, new energy would enter the stage in person of a king who would take Angkor to its artistic and political zenith in the 12th century. The groundwork, strong institutions, and expansive reach set by Suryavarman I ensured that Khmer Empire was poised to achieve a truly monumental status in the next era, especially under Suryavarman II, the king who would build the famed Angkor Wat and project Khmer power beyond its borders like never before. Well, the 12th century certainly opened with a change in dynasty, or at least a change in power faction. After a period of unclear succession, by 1113, a new king, Suryavarman II, had seized the throne. Now, he was not directly related to Suryavarman I, despite the similar regnal name, but he was a bold and visionary leader whose reign, from 13 to 1150, is often regarded as the pinnacle of Angkorian achievement. Well, his most enduring legacy is undoubtedly the construction of Angkor Wat. As we mentioned, this colossal temple complex was built as his state temple and mausoleum, and it remains the largest religious monument on Earth. Work on Angkor Wat began soon after he took power, and it likely took over 30 years to complete. Scholars estimate it was substantially finished by the 1140s. Dedicated to Vishnu, Angkor Wat marked a departure from the previous kings who primarily venerated Shiva. Suryavarman III was a devotee of Vishnu, reflecting the growing popularity of the royal Vishnavite cult. But the very layout of Angkor Wat is laden with cosmological meaning. It is a microcosm of the Hindu universe, with its moat symbolizing the encircling ocean, its series of concentric galleries representing mountain ranges, and its central quincunx of towers embodying the peaks of Mount Meru. The tallest tower, soaring about 65 meters high, housed the statue of Vishnu, and possibly a symbolic image of the king himself, united with Vishnu after death. The sheer scale of Angkor Wat is certainly breathtaking. It's why it remains a popular tourist attraction to this very day. It spans roughly 1.5 kilometers by 1.3 overall, with high walls intricately carved and a grand causeway leading to its entrance. Its bas-relief galleries contain kilometers of narrative carvings depicting Hindu epics like the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, scenes of courtly rituals, and a famous tableau of the churning of the ocean of milk, being a Hindu creation myth, wherein gods and demons pull on a serpent, wrapped around a mountain to churn the ocean for the nectar of immortality. It's a bit complicated, I know. We won't go into it at the moment. In any case, this particular relief is hailed as a masterpiece of Khmer art, and rightly so. It teems with dozens of gracefully carved figures, and may symbolically allude to prosperity and cosmic order under Suryavarman's reign. In fact, every surface of Angkor Wat exhibits expert craftsmanship. Thousands of celestial nymphs called apsaras are etched into the stone, each unique in pose and adornment, as if the entire structure is alive with divine dancers. Constructing Angkor Wat required meticulous engineering. Millions of sandstone blocks, some weighing 1 to 2 tons each, were quarried from the Kulen Hills over 50 kilometers away and transported to the site, likely via an elaborate network of canals when waters were high. Such a feat implies a highly organized workforce of architects, masons, sculptors, and laborers, supported by a robust supply chain of foods and materials. It is often said or estimated that 300,000 workers and 6,000 elephants were involved in the construction of Angkor Wat. These figures come from later Cambodian folklore and may be exaggerated, but they certainly capture the popular imagination at its scale. Even so, 30,000 workers is quite a lot, don't you think? In short, Angkor Wat stands as the ultimate expression of Angkorian temple mountain concepts, and just a testimony of the empire at its zenith, not just of its power, but artistic skill, economic might, and devotional fervor. And while Angkor Wat was being built, Suryavarman II was not idle in matters of statecraft and conquest. He proved to be an assertive military leader who sought to expand Khmer influence beyond the traditional boundaries. One theater of his campaigns was towards the east against Champa, the kingdom in central Vietnam, and Dai Viet, medieval Vietnam, in the north. Suryavarman II cultivated an alliance with Champa initially, possibly to jointly challenge Dai Viet, who were an ascendant power on the coast. Historical records from Vietnam recount how the Khmer king dispatched troops in 1128 and 1132 to attack the territory of Dai Viet. One Vietnamese chronicle notes that in 1128 the Cham and Khmer allied forces advanced into what is now central Vietnam. But the Khmer contingent, unfamiliar with mountain warfare and bogged down in terrain, was repelled. Suryavarman tried again a few years later with a fleet on the Annamite coast, but failed to make lasting gains as the Dai Viet generalship proved to be superior. These setbacks did not deter him, however. Instead, he turned his attention fully to Champa itself in the 1140s. In 1145, Suryavarman II launched a major invasion of Champa from the west. Khmer armies overran Champa's capital city, Vijaya, that is Champa's central capital, and defeated its king, Jaya Indravarman III. The Khmer occupied the Cham lands and even installed a puppet ruler on Champa's throne. This victory was a high watermark of Khmer expansion. You see, for a brief period, the empire effectively controlled parts of Champa, giving it access to the Cham seaports and the South China Sea trade routes. Victorious inscriptions in Angkor mention tributes from subjugated kings, perhaps alluding to this conquest. However, sustaining authority in a distant Champa proved to be quite difficult. Cham resistance simmered up, and eventually, by 1149, a Cham prince, Jaya Harivarman, rallied his people and expelled the Khmer garrisons, restoring Champa's independence. Around the same time, possibly 1150 or 51, Suryavarman II himself died. Rest in peace to him. Well, some suggest he may have perished during a campaign, whether in Champa or even in an ambitious but failed naval attack further north. We're not exactly sure. Firm evidence is lacking either way. But what is clear is that his death left a power vacuum. Someone was going to have to step into those shoes, and there were a few people eyeing off the position. The problem was that Suryavarman II had no adult son who was ready to succeed him. Perhaps his sons were very young, or he had not designated any. The empire, after such an apex of achievement, entered a period of uncertainty and turbulence. During the 1150s and 60s, Angkor saw a succession of short-lived rulers and internal strife. One king, Dharinandravarman II. That's a long one, isn't it? Give me one more shot at it. Dharinandravarman, that's it. Who was actually a cousin of Suryavarman, and importantly, the father of the future Jayavarman VII. Well, he reigned for a few years, but he didn't manage to restore strong order. He was followed by Yasovarman II, under whose reign court factions contended. It does appear that confidence in the royal house had wavered, and various ministers or generals had vied for influence. This instability provided an opening for the empire's enemies, and it was the old adversary, Champa, that struck the devastating blow. In 1177, the Cham people avenged the earlier Khmer invasions by launching a surprise attack against Angkor itself. According to both Cham and Chinese sources, a Cham naval force sailed up the Mekong River and across the Tonle Sap Lake, bypassing frontier defenses. They appeared before the unsuspecting capital quite swiftly, and in a dramatic raid the Cham fleet and army sacked Angkor. The city's temples and wooden palaces were plundered, and the reigning king, who had seized power for a few years earlier, was killed in battle. The Cham invasion of 1177 was a shocking event. Imagine that proud jewel of an imperial city, which likely believed itself invulnerable in the heartland of its jungles, suddenly being overrun, and the king slayed, right there on the streets. Well, it certainly shows that even at its height, Angkor's centralized system had its vulnerabilities, especially when weakened by civil discord. For the Khmer elites and commoners alike, this would have been a traumatic humiliation, a clarion call that the empire was in mortal peril. But Angkor was not down for the count completely. Not conquered. The Chams did not have the means to occupy Cambodia long term. But the damage was done. Cold comfort for those who had to walk among the ruins. In the aftermath, for several years, chaos and rival claimants reigned. Amid this dark period emerged one of the Khmer history's most celebrated figures, a prince who had been waiting in the wings, and who would soon lead a remarkable revival, and that is Jayavarman VII. Well, Jayavarman VII had a lineage tied to the royal family. He was the son of Dharinandravarman II, and a descendant of earlier kings. He was likely in his middle age when Angkor fell to the Chams. When the Cham invasion occurred in 1177, Jayavarman VII may not have been in the capital. Some speculated he was governing a province, or even living among the Cham. Imagine that. That's a scandal, isn't it? As part of a peace treaty earlier, he had possibly married a Cham princess, or at least had a few connections. Well, in any case, by 1181, Jayavarman VII mobilized Khmer resistance and mounted a counter-offensive against the Cham occupiers. With determination and strategic prowess, he rallied the Khmer nobility and common folk under the banner of liberating their homeland. A critical battle took place on the Tonle Sap Lake near Angkor, where Jayavarman's forces decisively defeated the Cham fleet. One inscription recounts how he, quote, crushed the Cham as one crushes a lotus stalk beneath their fingernail. Okay, then. It's a weird way to describe it, but, well, the Chams were expelled from Angkor, of course, kicked out, and Jayavarman was crowned king in that same year, 1181, taking on the mantle of a savior of sorts who restored Khmer independence and pride. Certainly one way to win popularity. Now, Jayavarman VII's reign went from 1181 to 1218, and it represents the final great chapter of the Khmer Empire. Not the final chapter, but the final great one. We had extraordinary achievements and pretty consequential transformations. After driving out the invaders, he didn't just rest on his laurels, he turned to building and reforming on an unprecedented scale. Evidently driven by a zealous vision for his kingdom. But unlike his predecessors, who were mostly Hindu, Jayavarman was a devout Buddhist, specifically following the Mahayana Buddhist path, which is different to the Theravada, but topic for a different video. In any case, he considered the bodhisattva ideal as the model for kingship, seeing himself as a compassionate ruler whose duty it was to alleviate the suffering of his people. This fundamental shift in religious outlook was revolutionary for Angkor's statecraft. It led to a wave of Buddhist iconography, though he did not wholly abandon Hindu traditions. After all, many of his subjects were still Hindu, and you don't want to upset them, don't you? The king's mother was remembered with a Buddhist temple, though, and his father with a Buddha-shaded temple that still honored Shiva. The best of both worlds, I suppose. Well, one of Jayavarman VII's first acts was to construct a new capital city, befitting a new and revitalized empire. So he built the walled city of Angkor Thom, that is, great city, on the site of old Angkor, but he vastly refortified and embellished it. Angkor Thom is a massive enclosure, 3 kilometers on each side, surrounded by a mighty moat and laterite walls, about 8 meters high, and with 5 monumental gates. Each gate, approached by a stone causeway, flanked the statues of gods and demons tugging a serpent, reenacting that churning of the ocean motive in 3 dimensions, a symbolic welcome into a sacred city. At the center of Angkor Thom, Jayavarman constructed its state temple, the Bayon, which is among Angkor's most iconic structures. At first glance, the Bayon seems like a chaotic pile of towers, but as you step closer, you notice the serene giant faces carved into many of those towers. In fact, there's over 200 of these immense faces smiling down from Bayon's peaks, often thought to represent the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. Hope I said that one right. Either way, it's the embodiment of compassion. These faces with half-closed eyes might also be semi-portraits of Jayavarman VII himself, merging his identity with the divine protector of the world. But in any case, he didn't stop at Angkor Thom and Bayon. He embarked on perhaps the most extensive building campaign in Khmer history, founding dozens of temples across the empire, which was still pretty vast. Significant among these were Ta Phrom, that is dedicated in 1186 to honor his mother, enshrining an image of Prajna Paramita, the personification of transcendent wisdom carved to resemble the Queen Mother, and Preah Khan, dedicated in 1191 to honor his father, with the principal deity form of Lokasvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, symbolically tied to the memory of the king's father. Now both of these, Ta Phrom and Preah Khan, were enormous monastery temple complexes, almost cities unto themselves with hundreds of shrines. We're pretty fortunate to have the original inscriptions from these temples too, which provide pretty astonishing details. For instance, the inscription of Ta Phrom reveals that a whole community was attached to the temple. It lists 12,640 people living on site, very precise, and it includes priests, assistants, monks, even 615 female dancers, the celebrated Apsara dancers who performed the sacred rituals. To support the temple's needs, it claims 3,140 villagers were under its authority, with a total of 79,365 people in those villages, contributing services such as rice, honey, textiles, and so on. The temple's treasures are tallied: thousands of ounces of gold and silver, tens of thousands of precious stones, hundreds of silk beds and parasols, etc. This inventory provides a rare quantitative glimpse into the scale of the state economy, showing once again how much wealth and manpower a Khmer king could devote to pious works. Similarly, Priya Khan inscriptions describe 121 rest houses called dharmasala, built along roads from Angkor, and 102 hospitals, arogyasala, established throughout the realm to heal the sick. The notion of a network of hospitals is particularly striking. Each hospital was staffed by a chief physician, assistants, and a store of medicines according to the stele. This public welfare initiative resonates with Jayavarman's Buddhist ideals. He has sometimes been likened to the Emperor Ashoka of India in his blending of governance and compassionate action. These rest houses, by the way, were essentially traveler inns where pilgrims or officials could stop and refresh themselves, often located roughly a day's journey apart on the main highways radiating from Angkor. Well, it's pretty convenient, I'd say. But what about on the foreign affairs front? Jayavarman was aggressive as he was in domestic works when we think about that. After repelling the Cham, he sought to permanently neutralize the threat. In 1190, he sent armies eastward into Champa again, this time under the command of one of his princes. The Khmer captured the Cham king alive and brought him to Angkor. Jayavarman then placed his own son, or perhaps a trusted general, on the throne of Champa as a vassal king. For the next decade or two, Champa remained under heavy Khmer influence. And while the Chams eventually regained their independence around 1220, shortly after Jayavarman's death, during that period, the Khmer Empire probably stretched from the border of Dai Viet in the north all the way to the west to encompass much of present-day Thailand and south into the Malay Peninsula. Jayavarman also maintained cordial ties with China. In 1205, the Chinese Song dynasty records receiving an embassy from the Khmer, perhaps exchanging gifts, trade goods. Likely lacquer wood, ivory, textiles were imported. In return, Chinese ceramics and silks came to Cambodia. Remarkably, Angkor in Jayavarman's era may have been the largest city in the world in terms of area. Recent archaeological surveys, using techniques like LIDAR scanning, suggest the urban complex of Angkor covered around 1,000 square kilometers, a sprawling combination of city, temple zones, and agricultural hinterland, with a population in the hundreds of thousands, some say up to 900,000 or more. Yet, for all of his accomplishments, there is a sense among historians that Jayavarman VII's achievements came at a great cost, and perhaps sowed the seeds of a later decline. That enormous expenditure of resources, in continuous construction, constant warfare, and maintenance of vast projects, it must have been a strain on the populace and the treasury. One clue lies in the art. The sculptures and reliefs of Jayavarman's reign, yeah, they were dynamic and grand, sure, but they're sometimes considered less finely furnished than the earlier ones. Possibly this is due to the rush and volume of the work. But there's also evidence that after his reign, many of those projects were difficult to sustain. But at the moment of Jayavarman's death, around 1218, by which time he may have been in his 90s, some say, a remarkable lifespan in that era, that's for sure. Not bad for 2025 either, if you can get there. The Khmer Empire stood seemingly invincible and radiant, having weathered a dire crisis, and then reaching its apogee. So the period after Jayavarman VII's reign, marks a gradual but then accelerating transformation in Khmer civilization. Just not the way they wanted. It was on the decline, that's for sure. The signs of change can be seen in religion, actually, but also royal priorities, external pressures, even climate patterns. It's a little complex, so let's talk about a few of the factors. In any case, the Angkorian world is fading. Firstly, the realm of religion and culture was one facet. The 13th century saw a profound shift. Jayavarman's fervent Mahayana Buddhism did not persist as the state ideology for very long. His immediate successor, Indravarman II, who was likely his son, reigning from 1219 to 1243, remained Buddhist and completed some of his father's projects without too much controversy. But soon a reaction set in. By 1243, a new king, Jayavarman VIII, took the throne and championed a return to Hinduism, specifically a revival of that old Shiva worship. Jayavarman VIII's reign from 1243 to 1295 is notorious for state-sanctioned iconoclasm. He ordered that Buddhist images and symbols be removed or defaced. Many Buddha statues in Angkor were mutilated during this time. Some Buddhist temples were converted back for Hindu use. For example, the central Buddha of the Bayon was torn down and replaced with a linga. But why such a vehement reversal? What was the problem? Well, possibly the old Hindu priestly elite, sidelined under Jayavarman VII, regained influence and convinced the king that forsaking Shiva's favor had brought misfortune. It might also be that Jayavarman VII's Buddhist zeal had been very personal. Once he was gone, people returned to their familiar deities, and the new king saw political advantage in aligning with the majority faith of the elite of the time. However, even as Hinduism was reinstated at the court, another, more quiet revolution was spreading at the grassroots, and that was Theravada Buddhism. Unlike the Sanskrit-based Mahayana Buddhism of Jayavarman, or the ritualistic Hinduism of the Brahmins, Theravada Buddhism was a version that came from Sri Lanka, via Mon and Thai people, that is, and preached in the local language, emphasizing personal enlightenment and monastic community. In the 13th century, many common Khmers and even nobles gradually adopted Theravada Buddhism. Itinerant monks from Sri Lanka, or the Mon realms, likely found fertile ground among a populace perhaps weary of labor-heavy temple cults. Theravada Buddhism did not require large temples or costly icons. A simple wooden monastery and an ordination hall would do just fine for them. And monks renounced wealth too, so there was also that. But the psychological shift is crucial here. The role of the king as a divine, godlike figure lost prominence as spiritual merit became accessible to all through good deeds and the support of the monastic community. The king remained important, don't get me wrong, but more as a patron of Buddhism than a divine figure himself. Over time, this undermined the ideological underpinning of the Angkorian Devaraja cult. Well, by the late 13th century, we got pretty clear evidence of Theravada's prominence. For instance, the Chinese envoy Zhou Daguan, who visited Angkor in 1296–97, observed that the people, including the king at that time, were, quote, worshippers of the Buddha, and that Buddhist monks in yellow robes walked the streets and resided in monasteries across the city. But he also noted that Brahmins still performed rituals at the court, but the presence of monks indicated a significant change in religious life. In any way, the Brahmins were not dominant like they used to be. Zhou Daguan's account, The Customs of Cambodia, is incredibly valuable as the only detailed eyewitness record of Angkor at its height that survives. He provides a fascinating, detailed description of daily life around 1296. According to him, the Khmer capital was still splendid, perhaps not quite as splendid as Jayavarman's peak years, but he describes the king, likely Indravarman III or his successor Surindravarman, as living in the sumptuous palace of wood with a roof of lead tiles which shone like silver in the sun. And there was also a golden tower, probably the Bayon, and a bronze tower, the buff one, that he admired, evidence that Angkor's great temples were still in use and in good repair. Joe noted that all public and aristocratic buildings faced east, and in the palace the king would give audience from a high window adorned with gold, with mirrors flanking it, and an elephant-shaped platform beneath, a scene that conjures the regal pomp of Angkor's court. But he also commented on social customs. A Khmer man or woman of any class would wear a single cloth wrap around their waist, and generally went bare-chested. Even the queen, he was astonished to see, to wear no blouse when attending ceremonies. Women could dye their nails, and even the soles of their feet red, while men could not. An interesting sumptuary rule. People commonly chewed betel, which blackened their teeth, something Joe found curious or unattractive, not being used to it. Joe Dagoan was impressed by the vibrant markets of Angkor, where he saw an abundance of rice, fish, traded goods, tropical fruits. He mentioned that large jars of freshwater fish paste, called prahok, and piles of rice were staples. One anecdote he gave is that slavery still existed. War captives or debtors could be slaves, but they might run away, and if they were caught, they would have their faces tattooed as punishment. Joe also detailed some legal practices. Trials by ordeal were apparently done by making suspects immerse themselves in water. Whoever came up first was deemed guilty. Harsh corporal punishments were noted for serious crimes, yet he observed that day-to-day life was quite orderly and pretty normal. Importantly, Joe confirms the presence of Theravada monks and Theravada ceremonies, such as an annual festival of bathing the Buddha, statues, and ceremony where new rice was offered and burnt in a Buddhist rite. The shift to a Buddhist social ethos likely made society less hierarchical. Joe was surprised that even the Khmer king would travel in relatively simple ways at times, and that princes and officials walked on foot in processions behind the king, who rode an elephant or was carried in a palanquin. However, the stratification was certainly still there. He describes how various ranks of officials had different numbers of parasols as insignia. Only the top ministers had multiple gold-handled umbrellas, etc. But despite the apparent liveliness of Angkor in Joe's time, he perhaps unknowingly hinted at stagnation in some areas. He remarks that writing was done on dried leaf or bark with chalk, Khmer and Pali texts most likely, rather than on paper, and that beyond the grand monuments many houses, even of the rich, were made of wood or bamboo and vulnerable to the climate. The once unstoppable machine of temple building had largely ground to a halt by the late 13th century, and indeed the last known Sanskrit inscription at Angkor dates to 1327, after which the practice of carving long poetic dedications in Sanskrit on stone had, well, pretty much disappeared. And this marks a symbolic end to the classical Angkor tradition of record-keeping. The absence of inscriptions suggests fewer state-sponsored temples, and possibly a move to more perishable forms of religious expression, like writing on palm leaf painting or just simple stupas for Theravada use. Well, on the geopolitical front, new external threats were emerging. To the west, the power vacuum left by Angkor's earlier contraction encouraged the rise of the Siamese kingdoms. During the 13th century, the Thai people, once subjects of Angkor in regions like Lopburi and Sukhothai, formed their own states. Now, Sukhothai became independent around the 1230s. Legend has it that two Thai chieftains rebelled against Angkor's governor and established Sukhothai as a kingdom. Though for a time, Sukhothai even paid tribute to Yuan China as a sovereign state, and other Thai principalities began nibbling away at Angkor's western periphery. By 1350, a powerful new Siamese kingdom called Ayutthaya was founded further south in the Chao Phraya Basin. Ayutthaya was expansionist and aggressive, and over the 14th century it increasingly came into contact with the Khmers, and contact became conflict. The once subject provinces, such as Lopburi and Suvarnabhumi, became part of the Thai realm. Angkor and Ayutthaya fought several times, and there are references to the Ayutthayan armies attacking Angkor in the 1350s and again in the late 14th century. Chronicles from Thailand claim that Angkor was seized temporarily around 1369 and again in 1389 by the Siamese kings, though the Cambodian side of events is not recorded in stone, as inscriptions had ceased. Each time, the Khmers might have paid a ransom or regained their city after the invaders withdrew, but still these repeated assaults weakened Khmer morale and strength. Compounding all these troubles were environmental factors. They had turned against them in Angkor in the 14th century. Paleoclimate records, such as tree ring data from Vietnam and sediment from Angkor's own moats, revealed evidence of a dramatic climate fluctuation. From roughly 1330 to 1370, Southeast Asia endured a mega drought, far longer and drier than normal. This would have lowered the water levels in Angkor's reservoirs and canals, straining the irrigation that the city's agriculture depended upon. Then, the drought was followed by periods of unusually intense monsoon rains and floods in the late 14th to early 15th century. The swings between drought and flood likely caused severe damage. Drought would dry and crack the canal embankments. Then sudden floods would breach them. Researchers have even found evidence of emergency repairs and modifications to Angkor's water infrastructure during this time, and that suggests that people were doing what they can to cope with the erratic water supply. The Great West and East Baray might have become clogged with sediment, or even broken at some points. In any case, without reliable water control, the rice surpluses plummeted. A city like Angkor, sprawling and fundamentally agrarian urban, was vulnerable to such ecological stress. In short, climate variability struck a blow when society was already politically stressed. It was a left-right combo, straight to the nose. So by the early 15th century, Angkor was a city under strain, politically contested, militarily threatened from outside, and economically weakened, not to mention spiritually transformed. The final act came with another Siamese offensive. In 1431, the armies of Ayutthaya, led by King Boromaracha II, besieged Angkor. This time it appears that Angkor Thom was taken after a siege. Siamese chronicles say the city fell after a 7-month siege that had cut off supplies. The devastation or loss of life isn't well recorded, unfortunately, but you can certainly imagine that after so many prior attacks and crises that this was certainly the last straw. The Khmer king, at the time, identified later as Ponnia Yat, fled the capital, possibly before the final fall, taking what remained of the royal court and treasury south. And indeed, Cambodian tradition holds that around this time the Khmer court relocated to the vicinity of Phnom Penh, a smaller trade outpost near the junction of the Mekong and Tonle Sap rivers, better positioned for maritime trade, and safer from Thai attacks. As for Angkor, it was left largely empty of its elites and administrators, and, well, it could no longer function as a capital any longer. It was well and truly over. It is important to note, however, that Angkor's decline was not a sudden apocalypse, where the city instantly became a ruin, but rather it was a gradual process of depopulation, followed by a loss of status. Some population likely remained around Angkor for a few decades, even centuries afterwards, particularly Buddhist monks tending Angkor Wat as a pilgrimage site. And in fact, Angkor Wat was never completely abandoned. It actually transformed from a Hindu temple to a Theravada Buddhist shrine, and remained a place of religious significance, which is why it was in relatively good shape, relatively, when French explorers rediscovered it in the 19th century. Covered in jungle, but, well, structurally still not too bad. But the urban and royal apparatus that maintained the extensive canal network and kept tens of thousands of workers busy was completely gone. Without maintenance, canals silted up, wooden homes decayed, and the jungle gradually reclaimed what was once hers. The Khmer Empire, as a centralized state, disintegrated. The 15th and 16th centuries in Cambodia were the post-Angkor period of smaller-scale kingdoms, shifting capitals, and struggles with neighbors. And that great grandeur of Angkor faded into memory and myth. That is, of course, until people like me and the team go and make a video about it. Well, I do advise you go and visit Cambodia. Lovely place. Good people. Good everything, really. Well, speaking of good people, I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulf, Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuroner, Darren, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, David, Brittany, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Catty B, Lovely, Bomber, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dode, Prinny, and Aiden, Fabian, Michael, and Agworm. Thank you so much. And that's it for me, I'm afraid. Why don't you go and, I don't know, book a holiday to Cambodia or something? I don't know. Easier said than done, I suppose. But if you do, they'll welcome you with open arms. That's it from me. Lots of love to you all. I hope you've all enjoyed. And I will see you in the next exciting video. Good night, and lots of love to you all as always.